So we are going to bind a quilt. We have our finished quilt top. It is quilted, and you need to measure the distance around the quilt. This small quilt that we're using as our sample is about 79 inches. So you want to make sure you have enough binding to connect the ends. So I typically add 10 to 12 inches to that measurement that goes around. So I'm going to lay my quilt top to the side. I'm going to take my binding fabric and make sure that it is even, and I will fold it so that the selvage edge matches the folded edge. Okay, so I need approximately 90 inches. This fabric, the width of it is somewhere between 40 and 45. So just for the sake of this lesson, I am going to cut 3 strips. Typically, a binding strip is about 2.5 inches. You can go smaller if the scale of your quilt speaks to that. So we will cut these strips at 2.5 inches. There are occasions when you need to cut the binding on the bias, giving it a little bit more stretch, but most of the time you can cut it across the fabric from selvage to selvage. So we are going to cut our 2.5 inch strips. And as I said, we will cut 3 of those strips to go around our quilt. So now I have to prepare my strips to be connected. I like the connections to go at an angle. So I use my 45-degree angle on my cutting board. So I will cut 2 ends, get rid of the edges, get my pins. So I have these 2 edges, ends of the binding strips, the 2.5 inch binding strips that were cut at a 45-degree angle. So I'm going to line them up where there is approximately 1/4 inch of that corner sticking out on top and underneath. And I will put a couple pins in there, and then I will do the other ends. And this fabric that I'm using for the binding has no direction. It's a tone-on-tone print, so I don't really need to worry about, the placement of it. So once again, I'm going to line up my raw edges and have about 1/4 inch of that point sticking out. So now I will go over to my sewing machine and connect these strips. You do not want to sew over your pins. So I have a 1/4 inch foot on here. I will take the pin out, I will put my needle down, and I will sew that binding strip together. I will cut my loose threads on my little points. Now I will go over to my ironing board and I will press open the seams that I just sewed. Now we are going to take our binding strip. These ends that are the selvage end, we don't have to worry about those right now. We are going to fold wrong sides together, matching up the raw edge. Okay, I've got my binding connected and pressed wrong sides together in half. Now I'm going to go back over here to my quilt top. Okay, so as this sample, we're going to have it rectangular where the smaller sides are top and bottom. Okay, I like to start and finish my binding in the lower left side, because when you're looking at a quilt, your eye goes to the top of the quilt and then travels down. You don't want your eye to immediately go to where the binding is connected. So I will take about 10 to 12 inches and I will leave that loose, and I will find a spot towards the lower left quadrant, and that is where I'm going to start. So I will take my quilt and my binding and my pins over to the sewing machine. Pin this if you'd like to start out with. I choose not to. Remember, I have this tail hanging here, and I put my raw edge against the edge of the quilt. I'm doing this in a contrasting thread so that you can see. Okay, so I have my binding lined up on the top of the quilt. We'll be turning this to the back side. Okay, you also don't need to do a reverse stitch at the beginning because you're going to come back and connect the loose ends. But you can do needle down. Okay, so with my 1/4 inch foot, I'm going to slowly, you can go faster if you're more comfortable with going faster, and I'm going to keep my 1/4 inch foot along the edge, and as I get towards the end, I want to make sure that I'm going slower. Okay, as you begin to do this, what you may want to do is take a pin and mark a 1/4 inch from the edge. So you are marking the quilt a 1/4 inch on the binding. Okay? We are going to stop when we get to that 1/4 inch. I'm going to take my pin out, I'm going to take my quilt out, and I am going to take my binding and I am going to fold it up to where the folded edge is now at the edge that I was previously using to sew down. So I kind of pivot it, make the folded edge at the edge. Then when I start back sewing, I am starting beyond the folded edge. And I continue. Once again, you're going to want to stop a 1/4 inch from the edge. going to take this out. Take your binding, take the folded edge up to the edge where you were just sewing and fold it down. It's very important that that's a clean and not, you know, all bumpy and you've got multiple layers under here that create a big lump. And we stop again and we turn that corner. And I find it easier if I've got my index finger kind of to swoop it up and make it lay just like I want to. Okay, so we're gonna, just because we want to leave enough room to connect, I'm only going to sew a few inches here. Okay, we take this off and we're going to go back over to our table and we're going to trim off any threads that may get in the way. Okay, I've got more than enough binding, so I'm going to cut some of this off so it goes away. This fine tool right here is called a shortcut binding tool, and I love this for connecting the binding. So what you want to do is get your quilt where you have the opening. Measure the distance in that opening with your tails folded back. This is about 5.5 inches. So 5.5, half of that would be about 2 3/4. So I'm going to take my Frixion pen and I'm going to mark that. Okay, I'm going to get my pins. Now I'm going to take my left side and I'm going to fold it on top of itself where the fold is right where I made that mark with my Frixion pen. And I am going to put a pin there. Then I'm going to take the right end and I'm going to fold it, butting it up right against that. So now you have two pieces folded against each other. Okay, I'm going to move that out of the way. And I'm going to mark ever so lightly with my Frixion pen. And this Frixion pen, and you can see up closely where I have finger pressed it. So on the inside, I'm going to continue to mark it. I will take my shortcut tool and where it says crease line, top right, I will lay that crease line with the top right, and on the inside of the binding, I will mark with my Frixion pen the edge of the ruler. Now this Frixion pen, once you apply heat, it's gone. Okay, so I've got that marked, and then I'm going to go over here to the left side and I'm going to mark the inside of it. Okay, now I'm going to flip my tool around I'm going to lay the crease line where it is. And I'm going to draw on my binding. And this drawing is all on the inside. Now I'm going to trim. So exactly like okay. Now you will see that your binding edges are going to line up. You're just joining the raw edges that you just created by that cut. Make sure that it's all laying flat. Okay, now we're going to go back over to the sewing machine and connect those two ends. Now you will see that it fits perfectly in there. So to make sure, we're going to go over here. We're going to open up this seam. And then we are going to press the binding down. And go back over to the machine and sew this down. Now, what I like to do before I'm sewing the binding down is from the top, I'm going to press my binding down with the seam that you created with the binding. I want it going out because that's what we're going to wrap our binding around. Now I will show you how this corner turns. This is a good place to trim the loose threads so that once you start sewing the binding down. Okay, so I like to start about mid point on one side to work. So I'm going to turn the binding down so that it just covers that stitching. And you can see the white stitching. I would have done this in blue had I not been demonstrating, okay? You can put pins here. You can use wonder clips. Whatever is best for you. Okay, so as we get to the corner, I'm going to continue to have my binding just covering that white stitching. I'm going to pull it out so that I have this straight line going. Then I'm going to take that corner and I'm going to fold it back so that you see where I've created this angle right here. I will stick a pin in here. And then I kind of do this in sections as I'm sewing the binding down. So I will show you how I sew the binding down on the wrong side, but I want you to see how that corner, because we stopped a 1/4 inch in and then folded back on it, it makes this perfect angle pivoting at the corner. Okay, so let me get a needle and thread. Whenever I'm doing hand sewing, I like to run my thread through beeswax. It just prevents knotting. So as I start, I'm going to take this pin out so you can see. I go under it and come into the fold. So that will bury the tail in the knot. Once again, if I was doing this for real, it would be in blue thread. So I'm going to take very small stitches going into the quilt just beyond that row of stitching and back into right at the fold. And I'm just going to keep doing that. So as I get near the corner, I want to make sure that that pin is right there holding that nice pivot we made down. So as I get to that corner, I continue on, and then right at that very corner, I want to go to the side I haven't been stitching, go back over and connect the two so that they are together from underneath. And your thread breaks. So then you just continue sewing your binding down all the way around. And that's how you sew a binding on a quilt.